to get my back blown out in peace. You think I got time to talk about a divorce that's a year old?
There was a lot of tension in the courtroom, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes breathing difficult. You felt as though everyone in the room was bearing the weight of the situation, as like there was something that would never be undone. Coming up, the long wooden table was occupied by Teyana Taylor. Her eyes were locked on the ground, her jaw was clenched, and her stance was rigid. She appeared to be urgently attempting to keep herself from unraveling, holding herself together with an unseen thread. Iman Shumpert was sitting across the room, leaning back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest, his countenance impassive. Their daughter Junie, who sat between them, was the only one who was unaware of the extent of her influence over the whole matter. Teyana and Iman's custody dispute had been unfolding behind closed doors for weeks like a soap opera. Fans had been picking sides and analyzing every little detail, every cryptic Instagram post, every paparazzi photo of Teyana entering the courthouse in her sharp suits and dark sunglasses, or a man leaving with his lawyer, flashing that half smirk that always sparked rumors, as rumors sop into the tabloids and social media feeding frenzy. However, nothing at all had prepared anyone for what was going to happen in that courtroom today. Everyone in the room was genuinely waiting for Junie to speak, but the judge's voice continued to ramble on about the legal process and the significance of considering the child's best interests. The moment at which the child's voice would be directly considered during a custody hearing was uncommon. However, the judge determined that it was required because both parents had been so insistent and reluctant to make concessions. In her lap, Teyana's hands were shaking. She had repeatedly assured herself that Junie knew where home was, despite her best efforts to conceal it by tightly interlocking her fingers, that Junie was aware of who had supported them through every bedtime tale, ballet recital, and injured knee. Love, her love, would speak louder than anything else, she had told herself. However, as a court-appointed child advocate led Junie to the front of the chamber, the young girl's gaze darted uneasily between her parents. Everyone in the audience wanted to protect her from the gravity of the situation because of the way she was looking. The advocate knelt next to her and asked the question in the most tactful manner imaginable. "Who would you want to stay with if you could choose where you live most of the time, sweetheart?" the woman said. There was silence in the room. The slight hum of the overhead lights could be heard, and someone's pen was scratching on paper before pausing in the middle of a line. Junie then spoke in a little distinct voice that was much older than she was. "I want to live with my dad." Like a cold, sharp blade, the words hung in the air. Teyana's head jerked up so quickly that it seemed as though she had been hit by the sound. Although her lips slightly opened, she remained silent. Looking for a clue that she had misheard, she gazed at her daughter. Perhaps there was something else that Junie had stated. However, Jun had a steady, composed, and almost relieved expression on her face. Iman initially remained still. For the first time that day, his countenance softened as he remained seated and fixed Junie with his gaze. He nodded to her slowly, almost subtly, indicating that he had heard her well and loudly. Teyana thought the walls were closing in on her. It felt like all of the air suddenly left her lungs. In quick succession, all of her memories of Junie, the giggles, the sleepy nights spent snuggled up together, the secrets whispered in the dark, flitted before her eyes. A voice inside her was shouting that this couldn't be happening, and she could hear the blood thumping in her ears. The judge praised Junie and had her removed out of the room to wait with a court officer while remaining composed and professional. However, Teyana felt that the hearing ended as soon as those words were uttered. Everything else vanished into useless chatter, including motions, legalese, and paperwork being exchanged between attorneys. She experienced blurred vision, not from actual tears, but rather from the overwhelming knowledge that she had just lost something she never imagined. Losing, she pushed back her chair silently, and the sound of her legs scuffing the floor reverberated sharply around the room. Heads turned as she walked toward the double doors at the back, her heels clicking loudly, and her hands clutched at her sides. Her lawyer, Teyana, reached out to touch her arm in a quick whisper, but she brushed him off without turning around. The sound struck her like a wave as soon as she pulled open the hefty courtroom doors. Mice were pushed in her face, cameras flashed, and reporters yelled questions. She continued. She remained silent. She simply continued to accelerate till she found herself outside in the intense afternoon heat. She heard the courtroom doors swing open once more from somewhere behind her. She didn't turn around, though. She didn't want to find out if it was a reporter, a male, or someone else. Her only desire was to move far from the structure where she had just experienced a heartbreak in front of a crowd. Her chest was heaving by the time she arrived at the black SUV parked at the curb, and the tears she had been suppressing suddenly came out. All of the events that had transpired suddenly came tumbling down. The courtroom, the verdict, the words, and the gaze. She slammed the door behind her with a finality that reverberated more in her heart than it did on the still street, her hands shaking as she pulled the handle and slid into the back seat, in an attempt to catch her breath and steady herself before the internal storm swept her down. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead on her hands. Observing her distress, the driver remained silent. There was a faraway murmur as the engine hummed softly, buried beneath her hushed cries. The city outside went on. People were walking, horns were honking, and life went on as usual. However, time paused inside the SUV. Iman stayed still and seated, inside the courtroom. He was staring at the door she had just passed a few seconds before. His posture was calm and poised, almost too composed, and his face was inscrutable. Later, some would murmur that his look had changed in some way. A shift in his mouth, a softening of his eyes, and a gloom of guilt that flickered across his face before completely vanishing. Some claimed that for a fleeting instant, it appeared as though he finally realized the extent of the harm and the gravity of what he had done, or possibly permitted to occur. Others, however, saw something completely different. They asserted that his eyes glistened with a silent joy, as though he had been anticipating this precise moment, as though her collapse and public disintegration were an essential component of his jigsaw. They believed that his silence was the result of deliberate control rather than remorse, a triumph that was gently declared rather than lamented. He didn't go with her, that much was for sure. He didn't even move in his seat, didn't call her name, and didn't run after her. As if her departure were a confirmation of something he had already decided long ago rather than a rupture, the door clicked shut behind her, and he sat motionless. She rocked a little outside the SUV, attempting to examine herself, and her breaths came in short spurts. The tears wouldn't go away. This went beyond the courtroom and the outcome. It was all of it. The loneliness, the betrayal, and the knowledge that the person she had assumed would support her had, without even trying, watched her fall apart. Staying any longer would have completely broken her, so she had left. However, she was aware that something inside of her had already broken beyond repair, even as she sat in the car attempting to gather herself. She would never truly know if he had felt triumphant or guilty in that courtroom. She only knew he had not followed, and that said it all. Within minutes, the word spread on social media. A blogger who was live tweeting the entire incident had received a text from someone at the courthouse. Hashtags were trending by the time Teyana's SUV backed away from the curb, with supporters analyzing the child's statement and speculating about what might have caused it. Team Teyana and Team Iman were at odds once more. Some said that Iman had deceived Junie by making false promises to her or disparaging Teyana behind her back. Others blamed Teyana, claiming she wasn't present, enough at home, and had been too preoccupied with her work and brand development. The harshest remarks, however, were those that merely repeated June's remarks repeatedly, like a blade, bending within the wound. "I'd like to move in with my dad." Even though Teyana's phone was constantly buzzing in her bag, she chose not to touch it. She didn't want to see her publicist's calls, her friends' texts, or the notifications that were stacking up from her social media accounts. In an attempt to understand how she had gone from being the focal point of her daughter's universe to sitting by herself in the back of a car, feeling as though she had been erased, she simply gazed out the tinted window as the city blinked by. And deep down, she realized this wasn't simply a momentary loss. Everything was going to change because of this. Hey, hey, hey.